Welcome, welcome. My name is Shara McCallum, and I am the director of the Stadler Center for Poetry. I'm also a professor of English and creative writing, poetry. I essentially am trying my best to walk in Jack's footsteps. So it's been a great honor and privilege to direct the center. This is my 13th year, and to have had Jack's wisdom, especially in the first years that I was directing the center when I actually had no idea what I was doing. And he was such a generous mentor and guide to me. Both he and Catherine have been incredible and supportive, and I think everybody in this audience this morning very likely shares in these warm feelings toward both of them. As you know, we're here today to honor Jack, and specifically for his work as a teacher. I led with the Stadler Center because I feel I would be really remiss not to mention that incredible contribution that he made, not only to Bucknell, but to poetry at large. Bucknell is really rare in that it has a poetry center. It is distinguished from so many other universities in putting that kind of resource behind that art form. And it was greatly Jack's vision that led to the founding of the center. He was the first founding director. So I want to thank you for that. I'm going to say a little bit about the scholarship. I'm here primarily as a sort of MC of the event this morning, and to let you know who's coming up. And so without, much fanfare, more fanfare, I will read for you the inscription for the scholarship, which is really what brought us here this morning, is that an anonymous donor made a gift in honor of Jack to create a scholarship that will continue his legacy as a teacher, as a mentor for generations and generations to come. So I'll begin by just reading the inscription for this. The John S. Wheatcroft Scholarship was funded from, as I said, an anonymous donor to honor Jack Wheatcroft, class of 1949, for his dedication to the craft of writing and to ensuring students received the best liberal arts education possible. A nationally known author, Jack was an English professor at Bucknell from 1952 until his retirement in 1996. He published 26 books and earned the distinction of Presidential Professor in 1972. Jack founded the Stadler Center for Poetry in 1988, along with Jack Stadler, class of 1940. Grants from the John S. Wheatcroft Scholarship shall be made to students based on financial need without further restriction. So, Jack, that's what we're here to commemorate, is this legacy of your work as a teacher crystallized in this incredible gift. There will be several speakers following me, and I'd just like to say who they are, and then they'll each come up in succession to the microphone, introduce themselves, say a few words about what Jack has meant to them. First, after I exit the podium, will be Peter Balakian, who is a professor of English at Colgate University. All of these are renowned writers, almost without exception. Gary Sojka needs no introduction, but he's a renowned sheep farmer, biologist. Gary's just renowned at everything. So following Peter will be Philip Brady, class of 77, who is also a professor of English at Youngstown State University. Then Jan Balakian, class of 83, who is in the English department at Kean University. Bruce Smith, class of 68, professor of English at Syracuse University. Those are the students of Jack who will come up and share their reflections. And then we will be closed out by Gary Sojka, who was also instrumental in the founding of the center, and he and his wife Sandy have remained incredible supporters of the work that Jack initiated. I'd like to just also point out that our president came into the room. He's in the back. John Brovman is here as well, so thanks. Before I leave, I really wanted to honor you, Jack, by reading a poem of yours. It's one of my favorites. And I don't think I'll do it as much justice, but I'm going to give it a shot. Dropping out of time. Between two notes, a mockingbird's throat is jammed by silence. A crab's hung up between pitch and toss, Tide and undertow are playing. A rabbit's foot is about to brush or crush a forget-me-not. Are bones in the process of crumbling or fossilizing? Out there and in some star, some midge hangs on the edge of extinction or birth, while an atom is poised to fuse or split as the instant collides with the infinite, where being's a luck which essence in need of an empty existence has struck. Closer to home, the nails and hairs stop growing, lungs neither take nor give. With blood on hold, the muscle of heart is clenched. Not a cell in the brain dares pulse. Now is your chance to release the circumscribed self. Let finger ends see in more than 3 dimensions. Eyes feel out the close-kept secrets of fur. Tongue whiff musk, lips hear purr of desire, and the mind drops out of time. Thank you, Jack.
So in a way, this is the house that Jack built. And it's great to be back in it. Jack pulled me aside one night in 1972 after a group reading we were a bunch of student poets doing a group reading, and he told me to come and see him to talk about my poems if I wanted to. And of course he didn't know what he was getting into, because that began an ongoing conversation, and I never let Jack alone after that over my student drafts of poems in that old Bison. Some of you in this room remember the old Bison with its kind of lunar 60s look. Frankly, I wish it were still, but it's a new age. So I guess I chart my own life as a writer from that moment of Jack's generosity. For me, Jack has been the embodiment of liberal education, which is subversive in its demand of critical thinking and its unmasking of power structures that are aimed at brutalizing the marginal and reducing complexity to cliches and cartoons. In a literary sense, Jack's unmasking always happened in his work and in the classroom, with the imagination, with language, with those acts of transformation. An empathic, creative force. Go back and read his early play, Ophodi, which is about living by the imagination and by language. Jack was a great teacher, both one-on-one and in the class, and he was always nurturing, caring. He was on the side of the student, appreciative of what you were doing and asking you always by his very intensity to do more. He taught literature from a deep place in himself. He believed in it as a sacred, secular script, something to live in and by. In Jack's lectures and conversations, there was always some existential urgency in his eloquence. And his eloquence was never sentimental, but always probing, always making connections, always about the hard act of being. He did a great deal here to create a literary community where writers and scholars and readers of literature could come together. The Stadler Center is one emanation of this, but there are many other spaces on campus where Jack made that community happen. And I don't want to forget the press of Apple Tree Alley, which Jack founded with his dear friend Barney Taylor, a press that was a fine edition, hand-typeset, homemade paper press of limited editions. Jack and I co-authored one together, as did Bruce and I know Carl Patton and Jack did one together. And then there was a whole series of Apple Tree Alley press books. And I hope some of you have those books. As you know, Jack was a prolific writer, poet, novelist, short story writer, and writer of plays. Sometimes romantic, often dark as a knife. He was obsessed with the grotesque, with human frailty, obsessed with emotional and psychological honesty in characters who were searching to understand themselves. His best-known book is Catherine, Her Book, a novel that revisits his own obsession with Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, a novel that thousands of Bucknell students learned with and from Jack. And some of you know that Jack never stopped writing. Shara mentioned how many books he's written. But I'm not sure if you know that in his 80s, Jack wrote 3 works of fiction, 2 books of poems. That's 5 books in less than a decade. At a time in which he didn't have a large publishing apparatus behind him and not a large audience. But his passion to make his art was supreme. The making was the meaning, and Jack's life was a focused and disciplined celebration of this fact. And I'm going to read to you just a piece from a later poem of his in a second. But I'd like to close, if you'll permit my slight memoiristic indulgence, just to say that out of our work together, we've had so much fun. On the softball field in the summers, on the tennis court, endless hours at South 11th Street with Jack and Joan, endless beautiful dinners, so many days and nights with Jack and Catherine at Gundy Farm, endless beautiful dinners, much wine, martinis, coffee, Jack's sardonic black humor, our laughing at the crazy world, the Yankees, the Giants, the Knicks, Beethoven concertos, Blind Lemon Jefferson, Baptist hymns with irony, with Bruce and Jack and Keeper along the river, or cooking with Jan, some Armenian fare for Mildred and Jack and Catherine on South Front Street, or with Barney in the typesetting room on Apple Tree Alley. Jack's generosity, always the animating life energy, and it still is. So this piece from Jack's last book, I Am, with a question mark, about making art, about making, the making, reminded me that the Greek word for poet is maker. To begin, this is just an excerpt out of a much longer poem. To begin, consider the shaped prisons in which Giotto, Vermeer, Georges Braque, and Joseph Cornell, to choose seemingly at random, found what shapes they had to confine, a gang of saints who are no more than they ever weren't. A woman who might be opening or closing a casement while she grasps the handle of a pitcher that is or isn't empty, a guitar without strings, a house of cardboard in which no children play, which has been made for dolls that before a prostitute named Barbie and her pimp named Ken weren't and still aren't. Are any of you following me? Or moving across to La Traviata, listen to the chants or melodies, the soprano and tenor who try to unmake the self in order not to be by shaping their voices to live in lines and spaces, scores of sound we can only hear as we listen in silence to their out-of-body vocals, while on pitch sounds our beat, blown, bowed, breathed, sighed, blared, rippled, clanged, and boomed into being, which wouldn't be if they all weren't led on by a conductor flailing dislocated arms.
So great to be here, and thank everyone for arranging this. The people I spoke to, I know Pat Flannery's been involved, and Lisa Cotet, Shara, this beautiful Stadler Center, which we owe to Jack Wheatcroft. When we think of great teachers, we oftentimes focus on things that they've said. But unsurprisingly, Jack's voice is so deeply inscribed in so many of us that echoes not just of what he said, but of the undertow. As his voice is still rising up in the voices of other poets now today, the undertow of silence that sustained Jack's teaching, and as we heard in the first two poems, and we'll hear in some more, his work as a writer. I love the fact that Peter reminded us that poets mean makers, because I was going to say that Jack always struck me as a composer. And the music that he loved was an analogy or a metaphor for his own sense of making things out of silence. And the silence was sustained with and by the language that he showed us, that you hear so eminently in all his varied work, extraordinarily prolific, and yet every poem crafted as if it were the only poem, today's poem. I remember something that William Stafford, another great American poet, once said after a long career of writing many poems. He was asked what his favorite poem was. And I think I can imagine Jack Wheatcroft nodding and agreeing with William Stafford's answer when he said, "The next one." When I was here as an undergraduate at Bucknell, I graduated in '77. Bucknell was a place that was half fairy tale, half fraternity. It was a very strange place for a boy from Queens, let me put it that way. Many of us not only grew up here, but grew into something that perhaps we might not have even known about here. And one of the features of this was that there were these figures, these great figures walking around who were all known by the same first name, Professor. And they were still people who walked through my imagination. But there was one who didn't have that first name. And when I think of all of Jack's writings and all of his teachings and all the things he said and the silence and the condition and undertow behind what he said, I think of the one syllable that totally differentiated him from every other professor. And the fact is that it wasn't a syllable that he taught us. And I don't think he ever told anyone to do this. It just occurred. And the syllable is Jack. That we students, 18-year-old ducklings, would walk up to this man of great eminence and great charisma and prestige and say, "Hey, Jack," teaching us that even though we were at wildly different statures, we were all engaged in the same enterprise, the same community, a community that's represented here today in our group, and a community that some of us here today have had the privilege of sustaining in a book about Jack. or inspired by Jack, called Poems in Their Making, which I'm proud to say Etruscan Press, which I direct, published this year. We circulated a poem, an essay of Jack Wheatcroft, which was a very familiar thing for us to do. There wasn't really a lot of question about how to receive this. We all thought, okay, here's something from Jack. We're reading it right away. And we did. And then 30 poets, friends, colleagues, students, wrote essays from their own poems. So I want to conclude with Jack's inspiring poem, a poem which, like so many, inspired all of us, and this one inspired a book. I know an old crone only found near places where man-made things have begun to return to the earth. Rock foundations of ruined bridges, timbers of antique barns collapsed and rotted away, harrows, plows, and threshers, abandoners on the land and rusted to umber. And once inside, a plot a father long ago had cleared and tended all his life, now almost field again. I watched her kneel and scratch the bramble back from a slab of withered stone, then peer as searching out some legend gnawed on earth's tomb by wind's tooth. Fisting one hand, she looked as though to knock, but slowly rose without and scuffed her across November fields. Thank you.
As an anxious freshman and then sophomore, junior, and senior, I knocked on Jack's office door so often that I know my knuckle marks are still on that door on the second floor of Von Lit. My aunt in New Jersey would tell me, "You're driving that poor Professor Wheatcroft crazy." But Jack was always there for students to help explain and listen. When I was having a panic attack about defending my thesis on William Saroyan's short stories, he ran out of resources and asked Catherine to step in. And so she did. There I was, shaking outside Von Lit, assuring me that things would be okay. I loved the way Jack led us by the hand through the texts with his eloquent lectures about the novel through Austen and then the novel through Conrad, poetry, creative writing, the course on drama. His lectures were oh so scholarly, from theology and medieval literature to its breakdown with Newton's influence on the 18th century novel. As he lectured, he always gazed out of that Von Lit window, communing with some mystical force out there, as if watching Catherine and Heathcliff walking the wild moors of Yorkshire in Wuthering Heights, as if Willy Loman were planting his garden in the parking lot of Von Lit. But by the end of the semester, he said he should become invisible, and so he handed over the power and the presentations to the students. I especially loved those free pieces that he assigned to freshmen. We could write whatever we wanted in any form. The only restriction was that we wrote our names on the back so that he could read each piece objectively. He would promptly return them, folded down the middle, with careful comments in pencil, always instructive, always encouraging, teaching us how words matter. As Catherine says in Catherine, her book, the word enables. But Jack is not just a great teacher of literature. He was good at and disciplined in pretty much everything he did. I remember that professors would call him in to break up fights in committee meetings because only Jack could handle it. I saw him making a garden outside Von Lit for a colleague who had passed away, and when he played tennis, he was a natural. I was amazed. He also generously nominated students for prizes, and later he would faithfully send us each and every one of his books with personal inscriptions, and I have them in a special place in my office that I show students. He is truly a Renaissance man. Jack will always be the student's professor, carrying the classroom from Vaughan Lit to the Bison over 11 a.m. coffee, ceaselessly giving us his time and his counsel. I will never be as erudite as Jack, but on the days when a few students in my class engage with the big questions that literature asks, I think of my students as Jack's grand students.
I always call him Professor Wheatcroft. I was never familiar enough. So I want to begin by reading a little something by my colleague at Syracuse, George Saunders, has written, and then I'm going to read one of Jack's poems. And it goes like this. Why do we love our writing teachers so much? Why, years later, do we think of them with such gratitude? I think it's because they come along when we need them most, when we are young and vulnerable and are tentatively approaching this craft that our culture doesn't have much respect for, but we are beginning to love. They have so much power. They could mock us, disregard us, use us to prop themselves up. But our teachers, if they are good, instead do something almost holy, which we never forget. They take us seriously. They accept us as new members of the guild. They tolerate the under-wonderful poems we write, the dopey things we say, our shaky-legged aesthetic theories, our posturing, because they have been there themselves. We say, I think I might want to be a writer. They say, good for you, proceed. And this is a poem from the title poem from Jack's book from 1967, Prodigal Son. Church of childhood, how many bombs have I plotted and planted, intending to rack your stones for years? Yet you stand intact in my mind, my father among palms, crow-robed, charismatic with the word, declaring me guilty till beaten I sin with the son who chose pigsty. Unseen, all-seeing eye God lurks in the intricacy of ceiling beams, whose straight lines somehow conform to dome. Hell brimstones in the boiler room, where, dazzling with sweated blasphemes, a man of shadows stokes and rakes white fires, one Deacon Buell, born slave, handsome, with power despite an age kid arithmetic couldn't calculate. Dark genesis of later lure all underworlds would hold for me, as the resolved geometry of overheads has proved too pure. No wonder, in the in-between called life, stained by sun through glass, Christ on cross, was oak pew, serge suit, scant grape juice, cubes of stale bread. I had to dive. Thanks very much.
I suspect there's some snickering, one, because I'm not really a writer, and two, because of the title of the poem I've chosen to read, because it has been pointed out that my wife Sandra and I are shepherds. And I wish to read a Wheatcroft poem about sheep, but that is not why I've chosen to read this one. We've heard comment today about how Jack can develop characters, about the way he can deal with deep emotion without sentimentality, the fact that he is a Renaissance man and would know about medicine and science, observes nature, but focuses on people. We know that Jack has a sense of humor, and we know that he enjoys wordplay. And having said all those things, I think you'll probably hear them one by one in The Hooked Ram. Nosing us, they bolt to a cul-de-sac where, come fall, they'll flock together for slaughter. At our approach, they hurl themselves against a dry stone wall. The ram leaps high enough to hook a horn in the wire strung on top. Neck twisted, rampant, he hangs. Left foot pawing air, right flailing stones, ewes and lambs scoot back to the open pasture. Paralyzed by ram's frenzy, I foresee wool blood-soaked from stone chafe, leg bone jutting through skin, eyes bulging as the sinews of his neck garrote him, struggling, dying into sheer exhaustion. She throws herself on top of him, arms down his flanks, hands wrapping legs to stop their thrashing, thighs vicing haunches as if delivering a sheep child belly down. Don't just stand there, unhook him. Taking his head in my hands, I feel wool oil, stone skull, smell lanolin. Lamb terror deadlocks man's strength. To lever his head, I grab the unhooked horn, use his skull as a fulcrum. Dumbly, he submits. As horn tip clears the wire, my hand's flung off, it snags on a rusty barb. Heaving her off backward, the ram runs free. Wondering when I was shot with tetanus antigen, I pinch and squeeze the puncture. It won't bleed. I suck, then spit. My spittle comes out white. At the dead-end wall, we climb a stile. Hard as I draw, bad blood won't run. I can't get out a word. My jaw's locked. We've heard a lot today about Jack as a teacher, and that is why we're here, to honor that. But Jack has given many, many gifts. You've heard of the gifts he's given to students, the gift of teaching, of introduction to a discipline, of friendship, and lifelong support. These are wonderful things. But there's something critical that Jack has done for this university that it's been touched on, but it hasn't been expanded. And it's that part of Jack's contribution that means the very most to me, and I suspect it does to President John Brovman. Because not many years ago, this university was in a serious crisis, perhaps one of the deepest crises it has faced in modern time. Usually when we think of crisis at a university, we think of financial exigency, or we think of declining enrollment, or we think of highly publicized shenanigans by faculty members, or student misconduct, or heaven forbid, cheating on the athletic field. Well, the crisis of which I speak is substantially more potentially devastating than any of those. There was a moment not too many years ago when this university teetered on the brink of changing its very ethos. And the seed crystal which caused all this to come together was the denial of tenure to some extraordinarily popular teachers. And the university was shaking at its core. This didn't get in the newspapers. The alumni were not terribly alarmed. It didn't make the Chronicle for Higher Education, but the outcome of that crisis would determine what this university would be. There were some of us who felt that scholarship was to teaching as sin is to the confessional. If you have not done the first, you have no real business in the second. And we were facing a moment where scholarship in a teaching institution was being challenged, whether or not it was necessary. But if we lost that traditional balance between scholarship and research and teaching, we would become something substantially different than we ever were, are now, and will be in the future. That's more important today than it's ever been, because at the time when many of you who've already read and have spoken of your friendship with Jack, when you came here, this is what higher education was. It was accepted that these were the places where you came to school to learn. That environment has changed. This kind of education represents a thin slice of the higher education world, and it depends for its very existence on the kind of person that Jack Wheatcroft exemplifies. The scholar teacher. The person who does not walk into a classroom with a carefully prepared, somewhat humorous, engaging presentation about a subject. No. It is the natural outflowing from a scholar who simply wants to help others understand the excitement of the discipline and gain the tools to work in it. That's a natural outgrowth of scholarship. And Jack is an exemplar of that approach. A number of years ago, in a kind of light moment, I mentioned that we in the academic world usually have 3 levels of achievement: assistant, associate, and full professor. And I made the comment that Jack did it differently. He was popular, highly regarded, and beloved. That's all true. But today, Jack, I'd like to point out, I think you've reached a 4th level because of the kind of teacher you are. Scholar first, inviting students into your life and your world. You become paradigm and icon of the scholar teacher. And Jack, I thank you for all of it.